You know, there certainly is a lot of confusion among believers, among so many, on this matter of quote-unquote hell. And of course, we're dealing, or at least we should be dealing, with the terms sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus when we're considering this subject, rather than using the word hell, because at the present time the word hell doesn't carry the connotation, to most of our ears at least, that it did several hundred years ago, which was not necessarily an improper one, because it did have the idea of concealing, or what was hidden, which is the general force of Hades, which actually means unseen. But today, when you hear the word hell, what one envisions is a place of some sort of awful and endless torment and misery, and something along those lines. And yet, whatever the case may be concerning the term unseen, or Hades, or for that matter, any other related matters to these various terms, we should not read such ideas into the words themselves, if we would be clear and fair with ourselves, first of all, as we study this subject, and certainly fair with God's Word, most importantly. The English word hell is, of course, a very old English word, and it's a Saxon word. It's a Saxon word from the verb helan, H-E-L-A-N, H-E-L-A-N, and it meant to cover up or to hide from the view, to hide from view. Even of late date, in certain areas of England, the coverings on books or the slate on rooftops has been referred to as a process of helling. That is, when covers were put on, or when something would be covered up, it would be referred to as a process of helling. And as a noun, this would be a hell. And the word simply, the English word, simply was referring to that which was covered up or hidden from view. So we should keep in mind that even in the case of the English word itself, it did not carry, even historically, the idea which most people have in their minds when they loosely speak about, and they usually say it in a very fearsome way, when they speak about hell, you know. Well, the Hebrew term that we first want to consider is the word sheol, S-H-E-O-L, in the usual transliteration of the Hebrew, sheol. It occurs 65 times in the Old Testament. 31 occurrences in the Authorized Version are rendered by the word grave, and 31 are rendered by the word hell. 3 times it is translated as the pit. Now, the American Standard Version, the Revised Version of 1901, transliterated the word sheol, and they always rendered it in simply English characters as S-H-E-O-L. The central thought of the word sheol is evidently that of ask, A-S-K, what you would ask about. We wonder what becomes of the dead, and we could speak of it as the ask, that which we would ask about. They go to the ask, or what we would wonder or inquire or ask about. That may sound strange to our English ears, as many things do that are not in accord with our own particular idiom, and lacking a harmony with our idiom and lacking familiarity to our ears. Many things will sound strange, but a frequent usage of them would quickly clear that up. And so we shouldn't be intimidated or concerned by a lack of acquaintanceship with some modes of expression that seem strange to us, for they wouldn't seem strange to us if we used them frequently, and if we spoke in a way as those who did use them themselves spoke, and they did not consider these terms in their ears as they used them to be unusual. Well, the word Hades is the Greek equivalent of sheol, and this is certainly a point that we should all know and have clearly in our mind, that the word Hades, Hades, is the equivalent of sheol. And to consider and confirm that, perhaps the simplest way to do it is to compare Psalm 16, verse 10, with Acts chapter 2, verse 27 and verse 31. Let's, at this time, simply turn to Acts chapter 2, verse 27, first of all. Acts 2 and verse 27. In reference to what David is saying of the Christ. For thou wilt not be forsaking my soul in the unseen, nor wilt thou be giving thy benign one to be acquainted with decay. For thou wilt not be forsaking my soul in the unseen, that is, in Hades, or in the Psalm it is rendered as sheol. And notice verse 31 concerning the patriarch David. He deceases also and was entombed, and his tomb is among us until this day. Verse 30, being then inherently a prophet, and having perceived that God swears to him with an oath, out of the fruit of his loin, to seat one on his throne, perceiving this before, he speaks concerning the resurrection of Christ, that, and then inciting the psalm, that he, Christ, was neither forsaken in the unseen, nor was his flesh acquainted with decay. And this is the word unseen, or Hades in the Greek, sheol in the Hebrew. Now, as far as the elements of the Greek Hades are concerned, it simply means unseen or unperceived. It's a negative form of the word perceived, or the verb perceive. The unseen is simply the force of the word, and we should not go beyond that as far as the meaning or central thought of the word is concerned. Now, when we're considering the central thought or the basic meaning of a word, we want to find the thought or concept that is common to all the occurrences of that word. We must have a basic idea concerning a given word that would be true to all of its contexts, how varied the figurative and usage, how varied the literal and figurative usage may be. We certainly will have a common thought common to all of the usages, or else we don't have the meaning. And so we want to know what would fit all of the contexts, but hopefully find one or more passages in which the word would be used in a way that would really bring home to us, as it were, the force of it. And I think we have one in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 23. Matthew 11, verse 23. And this is concerning the time when the Lord was reproaching the cities in which most of his powerful deeds occurred, for they did not repent. And he pronounced woe upon Chorazin and Bethsaida, and said that in the day of judging that it shall be more tolerable at that time for Tyre and Sidon than for these Palestinian cities. And then in verse 23 he says, and you, Capernaum, not to heaven shall you be exalted, to the unseen shall you subside. For if the powerful deeds which are occurring in you had occurred in Sodom, it might remain unto today. Not to heaven shall you be exalted. To the unseen shall you subside. You see, it's contrasted with the being exalted to the heavens, as it were, being exalted to heaven. The matter of being in the unseen, subsiding to the unseen, is contrasted with, as it were, being exalted to heaven. No, rather what they will come to see, and in fact the city long ago did come to that, was to subside to the unseen. And it's a matter of conjecture as to the original site of Capernaum, and it cannot be perceived or seen today. It is just unseen. That city has subsided to the unseen. And it's important that we note here that the Lord is not speaking of the people of Capernaum, but he is speaking of the town itself. He has just spoken of Tyre and Sidon, and how that the deeds which occurred in Chorazin and Bethsaida were not effective toward their repentance. And yet he said that if they had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented. And as well, the Lord speaks concerning this matter of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom might have remained unto today if the powerful deeds which were done by the Lord in the Holy Land, as we say, had been done anciently in Sodom. And so it's speaking about the city. I don't think anyone would claim that those very people in their mortal bodies would have lived for all the hundreds of years between the time when Sodom was destroyed and the time of the ministry of Christ. So it's evidently and clearly speaking of the city of Capernaum as such here, that it was to become unseen. And I trust that none of us imagine that that city, buildings and all, everything that comprises and makes up a city, is in some unseen world someplace, carrying on with all types of activities, but rather that simply it is now unseen. It just isn't there anymore. It is unseen. And we should not speculate as to what may be the case concerning the unseen, whether the unseen should prove to be a realm or a place, or whether it should be a condition or a state. We have to ascertain that from other revelation. But we can only see here that the central thought of the word Hades, or unseen, is just that. And we must not add any other word to it, such as place, that type of thing, because that is adding to God's word, and it is introducing the very thought which one wishes to prove by a clever introduction, and we should not assume that which is to be proved. That's a very elementary error in logic to do so. So this passage is very good to give us the force of the word Hades, that it means no more or less than the unseen, that which is unseen, and the various usages of it could be perhaps unseen in different ways depending on how it was used. But the word Hades can mean nothing more than simply and solely unseen. I hope that's something that you'll lay hold of. Now, Tartarus, our next term, Tartarus, is found only in 2 Peter 2, verse 4. And there's very little that we can know about this term. It is simply the name given to the place where there are gloomy caverns, evidently, where sinning messengers have been thrust. 2 Peter 2:4, For if God spares not sinning messengers, but thrusting them into the gloomy caverns of Tartarus, gives them up to be kept for chastening judging. That is, the point is, as it goes on to say, that he will not spare these hypocrites among the people of Israel who were claiming an acquaintanceship with Christ, and yet were not walking in the righteousness of the law. And the point here is that they were to be, and they were given up to be kept for chastening judging, to be kept for that judging. And it is the word kolossus, the chastening, the matter of pruning or chastening, the correction, the idea of correctiveness is in view, not vindictive punishment. But the word Tartarus is simply spoken of as being a place of where there are gloomy caverns that these sinning messengers that we can know very little of, and I hope we come to know a great deal about them someday, but it's revealed for our faith that they have been thrust away into gloomy caverns, which are called the caverns of Tartarus, as a proper noun, evidently. Now, these sinning messengers may be those referred to in Jude, verse 6. You may want to compare that as a side matter to consider. Now, our next word, we see we've gone through sheol and Hades, and just briefly on Tartarus. Our next term is that of Gehenna, Gehenna, in the usual transliteration, Gehenna. And this is the Grecian, or the Greek, mode of spelling the Hebrew words, the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna. When the Greeks would speak of this and take the Hebrew and put it into Greek, it would come out as Gehenna, and they are thereby referring to the Valley of Hinnom, an unknown man whose sons once owned the valley southwest of Jerusalem, which came to be an area when the people of Judah departed from the righteousness of the law into idolatry, that they came to be sacrificing their own children, even as the barbarian people in the land had done before them. In Leviticus 20, verses 2 to 4, this was prohibited, and yet in Deuteronomy 12:31, it speaks of the abominations which the nations formerly in the land promised to Israel that they had formerly engaged in when they were yet there. Now, I'll mention a number of verses that you'll want to write down and look up so that you'll have a familiarity with a background of what's being referred to historically when we speak of Gehenna, or the Valley of Hinnom. Joshua 18, verse 16 should be considered, and as well Joshua 15, verse 8, Nehemiah 11, verse 30, 2 Kings 23:10, and 2 Chronicles 33:6, and 2 Chronicles 34:4. Now, sometime after the years in which Israel, or Judah rather, began to sacrifice their children, King Josiah made at least an ephemeral attempt to have a renewed establishing of the law, and so that these abominations would not continue, he made it unclean to even go in to that area. Rather, he made it to be an unclean area, the Valley of Hinnom, so that folks would not go into there. The people of Israel would not do so, and therefore they would be kept out of that area, which had become associated and identified with such awful idolatry. And you can read of that in 2 Kings 23, verse 10, and 2 Chronicles 34:4. And he made it to be an unclean area, or portion of the land, by sprinkling, or rather spreading human bones through it, and not being under the law able to touch a bone or the body of a dead person without being unclean oneself, there would be an aversion to going into that area. And certainly by thus designating and manifesting this area as one which is now unclean in this way, it was a fitting type of the uncleanness, of the terrible, vile practice, unspeakable lowness that the flesh can get into, and we have been spared from that type of evil, at least ourselves today. And the idea of sacrificing children, even one's own children. So this is the type of thing that is in the flesh. And I think we should remember that when we read in Romans 9 that except the Lord of hosts had conserved us a seed, the prophet said, as Sodom we would become, and to Gomorrah would we be likened. It's a matter of being conserved from doing so, or if being left to one's own self, becoming that way. Now, very few people conceive of themselves as ever being capable of doing anything of the kind, and until they come to know something of what they are, they're not going to have a need in a practical way for God's grace for their daily living, for they imagine that they're good already and that they don't need His gracious saving hand for their daily walk. But of course they do, and the very imagining of thinking that they don't is a major departure in wickedness and evil itself. Now, on this matter of Gehenna, we should look at Matthew chapter 5 as well. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 22, first of all. Matthew 5:22. You hear that it was declared to the ancients, you shall not murder. Yet whoever should be murdering shall be liable to the judging. Yet I am saying to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to the judging. And again, the word every or all is always the all or the every of the context. Yet I am saying to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to the judging. Yet whoever may be saying to his brother, Raka, shall be liable to the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin is the Aramaic form of the Greek Sunedrion, S-U-N-E-D-R-I-O-N, the council. The council. Yet whoever may be saying stupid shall be liable to the Gehenna of fire. The Gehenna of the fire. The fire and the Gehenna that the Lord has in view. And this was well known to them, that this was the valley that was simply southwest of their city. In verse 29, now if your right eye is snaring you, wrench it out and cast it from you. For it is expedient for you that one of your members should perish, and not your whole body be cast into Gehenna. And if your right hand is snaring you, strike it off and cast it from you. For it is expedient for you that one of your members should perish, and not your whole body pass away into Gehenna. Gehenna is spoken of as the place in which one's whole body could pass away into, as the place where your whole body could be cast into. And keeping that in mind, let's look back at the passage which the Lord is referring to here, and actually citing. It's Isaiah 66, verses 23 and 24. Isaiah 66, 23 and 24. This is the very end of the scroll of Isaiah. And it comes according to the monthly quota in its month, and according to the Sabbath quota in its Sabbath. And I might mention that the little word in the Hebrew for quota, or sufficient number, is a separate word in the Hebrew, and it has simply been left out of many versions. It's not that everyone would all come at once, but rather that a quota will come in its month, and according to the Sabbath, in its Sabbath. All flesh shall come to worship before me in Jerusalem, says Yahweh. And they fare forth, that is, those who come and worship Jehovah or Yahweh in Jerusalem, they fare forth and see the corpses of the mortals, the transgressors against me. For their worm shall not die, and their fire, that is, the corpses of the mortals, their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched. And that is how it is that those who are the visitors in the respective quotas to worship before Yahweh in Jerusalem will be able to fare forth from Jerusalem and see the corpses of the mortals, the transgressors against him, inasmuch as their worm, that is, those transgressors, uniplural worm, that is, the many worms, shall not die. And their fire shall not be quenched, and they become a repulsion to all flesh. I think the worms not dying is a figure of speech, that there is no end to the worms, as it were. They shall not be deceasing, as it is in Mark chapter 9, in reference to this. I think it's a figure of speech in view of the fact that there will be no end of worms to be eating what is not burned by the fire. And, of course, this is a cleansing process to clean the area so that putrefaction would not set in, and there would be a corrupting of the air in a real serious way. And so these corpses will either be burned or eaten up by devouring worms. And this is quite an awful matter and quite a very real matter. But this is far from the eternal torments of the damned being kept alive in some sort of a burn-upable body of some sort. Rather, it's speaking of a specific event concerning the kingdom in Israel. And this is what is being spoken of. In Mark chapter 9, let's just notice that, again, this is spoken of in Mark 9:43, coming into Gehenna, into the unextinguished fire, where their worm is not deceasing, and the fire is not going out. That's right, it is not going out, and it is unextinguished. That does not say that it will never go out, and in any case, it is a fire that is concerned, and a worm or worms that are concerned with bodies or corpses of transgressors against Yahweh. And that is the whole point. And this is from a critical, historical consideration of this matter. This is the context. This is the way those to whom the Lord was speaking would, of course, think of these things. And we should not imagine something else other than what is said, but know clearly what is being spoken of, and not be disposed above what is written to making any guesses as to this representing something else, because there's no indication that that is the case. There's no reason for that to be the case. And if one starts doing something like that, why, there's no end to it. And who's to say when it can be done and when it can't be done? And there's no need for it, furthermore. But we know that Gehenna is simply this valley, and what is in reference is when the judges are restored as at the beginning, as it states in Isaiah 1, verse 26, and the council, or the Sanhedrin, is established, that those who had violated the law at a serious enough level to warrant the condemnation of death, that their bodies, rather than being buried, would be subjected to the shame and the ignominy of being cast into this valley to be devoured by the worms, or to be burned in the fires kept going there for the relative cleansing of the area. So this is what is in view in Gehenna. And let us believe it, but not believe something else that it doesn't say at all. And a psalm that is pertaining to this time as well, that I'll read from just briefly, is Psalm 101, verses 7 and 8. Psalm 101, verse 7 and verse 8. And you should note this in the revised version. I don't think the authorized quite has the sense here. I'll be reading it from the yet unpublished Concordant version. Not dwell within my house shall a doer of deceit. A speaker of falsehoods shall not be established in front of my eyes. In the morning, that is, it will be a matter that is taken care of with punctuality. In the morning will I efface all the wicked of the land, to cut off from the city of Yahweh all contrivers of lawlessness. So those are the three verses I would especially associate together. The one here in Psalm 101 and the others in Isaiah 66 and in Matthew chapter 5 or Mark chapter 9 as well. Now let's go ahead and consider the revelation that's given to us concerning the lake of fire. First of all, let's notice the references to it in Revelation chapter 20. The only references to the lake of fire are given in all of the scriptures. They're only given in these latter chapters, about 4 or 5 occurrences, and they're only given in these latter chapters of the book of the unveiling, or the Revelation. And let's notice Revelation 20, verses 14 and 15. And death and the unseen were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. This happens subsequent to the rest of the dead coming alive and being judged in accord with their acts. And it says, death and the unseen were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone was not found written in the scroll of life, he was cast into the lake of fire. And without considering an interpretation of various important things here, for the moment, I just want to consider one important thing, which is this, that the lake of fire is said to be the second death. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Or over in chapter 21 and verse 8, concerning certain sinners, it is stated that their part is in the lake burning with fire and sulfur, which, that is, this lake burning with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Which is the second death. Now, we have a few other references to this as well, and let's look in chapter 19, verse 20. Chapter 19, verse 20, concerning the wild beast and the false prophet. And the wild beast is arrested, and with it the false prophet, who does the signs in its sight, by which he deceives those getting the emblem of the wild beast, and those worshipping its image. Living, the two were cast into the lake of fire, burning with sulfur, and the rest were killed with the blade which is coming out of the mouth of him who is sitting on the horse. And all the birds are satisfied with their flesh. Living, the two were cast into the lake of fire, burning with sulfur. And in chapter 20 and verse 10, and the adversary who is deceiving them was cast into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the wild beast and where the false prophet are also. And they, that is the adversary, the wild beast, and the false prophet, and they shall be tormented day and night into or for the eons, namely the eons of the eons, the remaining Aeonian times revealed to us. They'll be tormented for or into the eons of the eons. They'll be tormented. Now, it does not say that they will be chastened or that they will be punished in this, but it states that they will be tormented. And to grasp the force of the word tormented, it should help us to look at it in another context. And in Mark chapter 6 and verse 48, we read of the disciples when they were on the ship in the middle of the sea, and the Lord was alone on the land, and he perceived their being tormented in rowing. And we read here, and perceiving them tormented in rowing, for the wind was contrary to them, about the fourth watch of the night, he is coming toward them, walking on the sea. He perceived them being tormented, inasmuch as the wind was contrary to them. So this gives us a good picture of something that can really be a torment, is when you would be rowing and the wind would be contrary to you. Well, those who would have the superhuman vitality to withstand the lake of fire burning with sulfur, that in order to be able to withstand this, and indeed to do so for more than an entire eon, for the eons of the eons, however long this may prove to be, they would certainly have a ability that none of us have today. And it is important to note that this is only said concerning the slanderer, the wild beast, and the false prophet. As far as those sinners among mankind that are spoken of later in chapter 20 and in chapter 21 as well, it says concerning their part that it is in the lake burning with fire and sulfur, which is the second death, And there's no reason to take this as a figure unless it would be just untenable to do so as a literal fact. And I, at least for myself, cannot say that I know of any reason that it cannot be taken literally. But let us not be extremely dogmatic on some of these matters that we know little about, and be satisfied that in God's wisdom and love and righteousness and justice that it will be dealt with in some sense as it's described to us here, and that we can enter into it to some degree, and hopefully lay hold of it in a way that is not altogether, at least, incorrect. But to think that we'll just perceive these things ideally is something that we should not be ultra confident about, or I think it's very unlikely that we'll do that. Let's approach these things in a humble way, and to come to understand them, and to not be flippant, but endeavoring to be very careful. So this is the torment of the lake of fire for some, and evidently the second death for others. So now we've considered the English term of so-called hell, as well as Hades and sheol, Tartarus, Gehenna, and the lake of fire. And there's one other term that I would like to consider at this time, and that's the term paradise, or paradisos in the Greek. It's from a Persian term, and we spell it in English characters Paradeisos. Now, in the Septuagint version of the Hebrew Scriptures, and I might say that the Septuagint was made several hundred years before the time of Christ, and it was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which was popularly used among the Jewish people, that they translated in that version, to which those of the first century were well acquainted. They translated the term in Genesis 2:8, the Hebrew term that we know as garden, speaking of the Garden of Eden. They translated it as paradisos. And that is, as a paradise. Well, Matthew chapter 19, verse 28 speaks of the Renaissance, the time of the beginning again in glory of the Messiah's kingdom, and a time at least when the curse pronounced in Genesis 3:17 to 19 and Romans 8:20 to 22 speaks of this as well, that when this curse will at least begin to be being lifted. And Isaiah 35 is a wonderful chapter that speaks of the renewal of the land of Israel and of the desert blossoming like a rose rather than being just a wasteland. And in Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 35, we have a passage that should be helpful to us on this subject. Ezekiel 36 and verse 35. And they will say, this, the desolated land, has become as the garden, or the paradise in the Greek, as the Garden of Eden, and the cities, deserted and desolated and demolished, dwell defended. The desolated land has become as the Garden of Eden, or the paradise of Eden. And this is the concept that the Jewish people were well aware of in these passages. Also in Isaiah 51, verse 3, a promise concerning the kingdom. Let's look at this in Isaiah 51, verse 3. And this is from the time onward, which is declared in Revelation 11:15, when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. In Isaiah 51, verse 3, for comforted by Yahweh is Zion. He comforts all her deserted ones, and he will constitute her wilderness as Eden, and her gorge as the garden, or paradise in the Septuagint, as the garden of Yahweh. Elation and rejoicing shall be found in her, acclamation and the sound of melody. So these are passages, all of which were well familiar to the Jewish people in the first century. And in Luke chapter 23 and verses 42 and 43, we have the account of the malefactor. It should not be thief, but one who was a malefactor. And when he is being crucified beside the Lord Jesus, we read of his words and the wonderful repentance or change of mind that this man had come to have. Even though others who were hanging there with him were blaspheming, saying, "Are not you the Christ? Save yourself and us." They did not have the perception to see that he was, as this man did. And notice that while this was going on, in verse 40, yet answering, the other one, rebuking him, that is, the one who was saying such caustic and unbelieving things, that the other one, the other malefactor, averred, yet you are not fearing God, seeing that you are in the same judgment. This man saw the wickedness of the other malefactor, and indeed of himself. And he said, and we indeed justly, that is, we're undergoing this, for we are getting back the deserts of what we commit, yet this one commits nothing amiss. And he said to Jesus, be reminded of me, Lord. Be being reminded of me, Lord, whenever that may be being reminded of me, Lord, whenever thou mayest be coming in thy kingdom. This is spoken of as the time when the Lord may be coming in his kingdom. That the request is that this man would be one that the Lord would be being reminded of. And Jesus said to him, "Verily, to you am I saying today, with me shall you be in the paradise." Notice the article is there. With me shall you be in the paradise. Let's notice that this is future. Let's notice in Revelation 2, verse 7. And here are promises concerning those ecclesias which John saw in spirit in the Lord's day, the time of the Hebrew prophets, of the day of the Lord, or the Lord's day. And in Revelation 2:7, he says, "To the one who is conquering, or overcoming, to him will I be granting to be eating of the log of life, which is in the center of the paradise of God." And likewise in Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2. Note this same expression. "And he shows me a river of water of life, resplendent as crystal, issuing out of the throne of God and the Lambkin. In the center of its square, and on either side of the river, is the log of life, producing 12 fruits, rendering its fruit in accord with each month. And the leaves are for the cure of the nations," describing this glorious paradise. Well, this is what the Scriptures describe, both in the Hebrew and Greek Scriptures, as the paradise of which the malefactor would have known about. And notice that it is when he comes into his kingdom that he is requesting that the Lord would be reminded of him. And when he comes into his kingdom is basically that of Revelation 11, verse 15, when the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth is first begun. And if you would translate, or not translate, but render this with a comma, punctuate this, "Verily to you am I saying today," "Verily to you am I saying, today with me shall you be in the paradise," where I'm going in my immortal soul right here today. Well, that couldn't be so, because he died that day and he went into the unseen. He just disappeared in death. His soul, or his sensations, ceased and they became unseen. And this is really clear when we think of even similar punctuations in Acts 20, verse 26, and Acts 26, verse 2. Let's look at Acts 20, verse 26 in a similar construction. "Wherefore I am attesting to you in this very day that I am clear from the blood of all," you see. Or in Acts 26 and verse 2. "Concerning all that which I am being indicted by the Jews, King Agrippa, I have deemed myself happy to be about to make my defense before you today, especially as you are expert, versed in all," and so on. Well, it's what he was saying that very day. And I would say an English parallel could well be, for instance, "I am telling you right now," you would say to your children, "I am telling you right now, go clean your room," you see, for example. Go do this or that. Now, this is a solemn idiom, a very solemn idiom to express matters this way, and it's used for stressing great emphasis. It's a Hebraism. It's a way of, in the Hebrew mode of thought, of putting great emphasis on what is stated. And there are many examples of using the word today in this very manner in the book of Deuteronomy. And we won't turn back to them, but I'll just give you a few to look up on your own. Deuteronomy 4, verse 26, and Deuteronomy 4, verses 39 and 40, Deuteronomy 6, verse 6, 7, verse 11, 8, verse 1, and 8, verse 11. We could go on. There are many more there at the end of the 40 years when Israel was about to go into the land, and the solemnity of what was declared at that time. And so it was said to them on that day, you see. And likewise the Lord was saying to them, or to him, to the malefactor, on the day to which he spoke to him, promising him and assuring him, with me shall you be in the paradise. The paradise. All right, that's about all I could really say on that matter, and I hope that it will be clear to you. Now, in our next study, we want to consider something of the usage of the word spirit and the word soul. But I won't get into that for now, so that we can study it in at least some depth in the next message. But let's just quickly review that the English word hell simply had to do with the idea of hiding something or covering it from view, and that sheol and Hades are the Greek and Hebrew equivalents of each other, and we're speaking about the unseen, or what you might ask about. And the Hades is just where the city of Capernaum subsided to. It was seen, and then it was unseen. You don't see that city any longer, and you must not add the idea of place to it, because that is not part of the meaning of the word, and so we should not do so. Tartarus is evidently a place. At least it has gloomy caverns, the gloomy caverns of Tartarus, where the sinning messengers are being kept for chastening, judging. Gehenna is simply speaking of the valley southwest of Jerusalem, where the corpses of criminals, serious violators of the law of Moses, will, after being put to death under the law, will have their corpse or their body, rather than being buried, placed into that valley with the attendant shame that will come upon their name, and indeed such an indecent lack of burial. And so this would be quite an abhorrent matter. The lake of fire is said to be a place of certain torment for, or into the eons in view, into the eons of the eons, for the slanderer, the wild beast, and the false prophet. For men it is spoken of as the second death. And the paradise is simply an equivalency for the garden or the park of to which Israel will be changed when the desert will blossom as the rose in glory. And the malefactor asked the Lord to be reminded of him at that time when he would be coming into his kingdom, into this wonderful paradise. And in his grace, for salvation is by grace, certainly in this case as well, that the promise was made that you will be with me in that paradise to this malefactor. So let's keep those things in mind. In our last study, we considered the idea of hell, popularly so called, and went through the terms of sheol, Hades, Gehenna, Tartarus, and paradise. However, we did not yet consider, though I may have touched upon just briefly, the matter of soul and of spirit. And certainly these two terms are worthy of much study, and even though these are the only two things that I want to consider now, I think that we'll have much to do just to give some serious consideration of spirit and soul. And we're dealing with two Greek terms, pneuma in the case of spirit and suke in the case of soul. P-N-E-U-M-A, pneuma, and suke, P-S-U-C-H-E, for soul. Now, first of all, with the word spirit, let's turn to Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. And for now, I won't get out my typed copies of the unpublished Concordant version. I'll just use the revised version of 1901. And the dust returneth to the earth as it was, and the spirit returneth unto God who gave it. This is surely a key verse concerning spirit. Yet we want to grasp the force of spirit, and inasmuch as we will see that spirit is actually intangible, it's not an easy matter for us to either discuss or to meditate upon in our minds. But we do have at least one very helpful example, an illustration of spirit that gives us about all we can grasp or use on this subject anyhow, and yet I find it to be very, very helpful. And it's in John chapter 3, verse 8. And a blast of wind is likened unto spirit. There is considerable likeness between a blast of wind and spirit. And in fact, really, pneuma is blast, but it's evident from context whether we're speaking of a figurative blast, as it were, that is, of wind, or a blast, or that which produces an effect, the power which brings action and life and intelligence to be. But as far as a literal blast of wind is concerned, in John 3:8, the blast is blowing where it wills, and the sound of it you are hearing, but you are not aware whence it is coming and where it is going. Well, that gives us some likeness to spirit, the intangible power that is keeping all together. We know that God is spirit. Not is a spirit, as in the authorized, but it's literally just God spirit, or supplying the verb for the sake of English. God is spirit, literally, in John 4:24. Now, figuratively, he is, metaphorically, light, when the verb is added in the Greek as a figure of speech. This is that. But literally, God spirit, of John 4:24. God is spirit. He's the imperceptible power behind everything. We live and move and have our being. We are in him. Let's notice in this subject that it takes much patience and consideration of it to get what benefit we will from it. The keyword concordance definition of spirit, I haven't found anything better than this. I haven't been able to either establish anything more clear myself, and I certainly haven't read anything any better than this elsewhere. I think this is very satisfactory, at least, when we read of pneuma, that this is, by implication, spirit. It's literally blow effect, or the result of blowing, or of a blast, but by the figure of implication, where we're using it as that which is actually the matter that we can merely describe by literal wind or blowing. By implication, spirit, that is, pneuma, is spirit. It is the imperceptible, intangible. You see, that's why it's hard to deal with the matter, because it's imperceptible and intangible, and we only have the likeness of a blast of air to give us something to lay hold of. Spirit is the imperceptible, intangible power of Those are the key words. The imperceptible, intangible power of action, life, and intelligence. The divine power. Spirit is the divine power as manifested in his invisible, intangible operations. The key words are the words the power of. The divine power is manifested in God's invisible, intangible operations in the results or the effect of his work. What produces all action, life, and intelligence is this imperceptible, intangible power thereof. And that is the sense of the word spirit. That's what we're speaking of when we read of pneuma in the scriptures, and when we think of the word spirit in the English. It's the imperceptible power of action, life, and intelligence. Even as we read of mankind in general, of humanity, that the spirit which is in man, this imperceptible power which is in man, which produces his life, his action as he lives, and what intelligence he may have, this imperceptible power returns to God, who is spirit. And we all live, move, and have our being in him. We are in him. This returns to him when we die. This power of what we are and what we do. Now, the Spirit imparts or produces the life and the action and the intelligence. Well, we could also note of Stephen, or in Acts chapter 7, or just turn to the Lord's words in Luke 23 and verse 46 concerning his Spirit. And we must have a clear thought of what we're speaking of, so that when you hear the word Spirit, and when you think about the word Spirit, that you're thinking of the power of everything else, the power of action, life, and intelligence. It's the power thereof. Luke 23 and verse 46. And shouting with a loud voice, Jesus said, Father, into thy hands am I committing my spirit. Now, saying this, he expires. The time of his death. He said, I commend into thy hands my spirit. I am committing it into thy hands. This is the matter of spirit. We could go to other passages, but I don't know that they would really give us that much more light, but simply repeat much of the same. Certainly you can study other occurrences in the Concordance, but I hope that these examples will serve our purpose for today. Now, likewise, let's consider the word soul, suke, and let's turn to Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 8. First of all, Isaiah 29 verse 8. And we are not interested, as far as our scriptural studies go, I don't mean that we want to be ignorant of, but we are not fundamentally, at least, interested in the religious or philosophical ideas of human religions and philosophies, in which they may have, and in many cases have, used these basic words. But we're interested in what is revealed in the scriptures concerning them, as to what God reveals in his intention of them. And so we don't want to have all sorts of loose usages of the present world in which we live, or former eras of this world before we ever came along. They might be in conformity, but they might not. Let's base nothing on those things, even though we may want to consider them. And it's hard not to, since we're generally more familiar with them, sad to say, than with the Scriptures. But let's base and really especially think about the scriptural usage. And here's just one good example. In Isaiah 29, verse 8, "And it comes to be as when one is famishing, as when one who is famishing is dreaming, and behold, eating is he, yet he awakes, and empty is his soul." That is, he was famished, and he awakes, and his soul is empty. That is, his senses, what he's able to sense, or mentally perceive and be cognizant of, due to the perception that he has. And we human beings have what awareness or perception that we have through our senses of seeing and tasting and telling and smelling and feeling. The five senses. I don't know if I named them all or not, but I hope I did. Well, the matter here is a good example. Let's also look at Genesis 42 and verse 21. Genesis 42 and 21. "And saying are they, each man to his brother, Nevertheless, guilty are we on account of our brother, when we saw the distress of his soul, when he supplicated us, and we did not hearken. Therefore comes on us all this distress." When we saw the distress of his soul, that is, everything that he could have experienced, that Jacob could have experienced in his distress, and he would have experienced that or sensed that distress through all of his senses. They were probably all affected. And it is the distress of his soul. See, the force of it is that which is manifested through your senses. That's a good example of that. We won't turn to it, but you could note Deuteronomy 12:15 through 23, when the festivals were occurring. Israel was encouraged to have whatever their soul desired in the way of good food and drink, to enjoy this time of festivity, that whatever their soul desired. That is, that they would have things that really tasted good and would be really things that they would enjoy, that they would really desire in their soul or their sensations. So that's what we're speaking of. Let's also look at just a few more. Job chapter 10 and verse 1. Job chapter 10 and verse 1. "My soul is weary of my life." See, we don't want to confuse the word soul and life. "My soul is weary of my life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." Your soul could be weary of the life that you're living and have bitterness of soul. Again, we're talking about what we experience or sense, the experiences that we go through when we're speaking of our soul. Let's look next to Psalm 43, verse 5. Psalm 43, 5. "Why art thou cast down, O my soul? And why art thou disquieted within me? Hope thou in God, for I shall yet praise him, who is the help of my countenance and my God." It's, why are you cast down? Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Again, this has to do with everything that we experience through our faculties. And Psalm 107, verse 18. 107, verse 18. "Their soul abhorreth all manner of food." Well, that's a similar thought. Or in Matthew 6, verse 25, it is not, "Do not take any thought for your life as Most are probably used to reading it in the Authorized, but this is the word soul as well. Do not worry about your soul, what you may be eating or what you may be drinking, nor yet about your body, what you should be putting on. As far as the body itself was concerned, you put clothes onto the body, but what you would sense in the body or experience would be, for example, eating or drinking, or for that matter, cold or heat or fragrances or whatever it might be, anything that you could perceive through your senses. I don't have it in my notes, but one of the Proverbs is that a righteous man regards the soul of his beast. The Authorized will say the life of his beast, but I'm afraid that the Society for the Prevention of the Cruelty to Animals would see, and often do see, people who may pay sufficient regard to their animals, pets or livestock, to keep them alive, but yet treat them so poorly that they have no regard at all, or at least very little, for their well-being or for their sensations, for their soul. And that's in the Proverbs, and that's a real good one as well, to give us the force of this word. The soul is the consciousness or sensation produced by the combination of an organic body with spirit. That's a note that I have written down myself, and perhaps you would like to get that. I'll say it again. The soul is the consciousness or sensation produced. It's the result, you see. The soul is the consciousness or sensation produced from the combination of an organic body with spirit. And Genesis 2, verse 7, gives us good light on this. Genesis 2:7. And forming is Yahweh Elohim, the human of soil from the ground, and he is blowing into his nostrils the breath of the living, and becoming is the human a living soul. When the human is now composed and formed of soil, and when Yahweh blew into his nostrils the breath of the living, or the imperceptible spirit of the living, the human became a living soul, and becoming is the human a living soul thereby. Well, that is the force of it. He became a living creature, and he had the soul, the phenomena, operating in him. Let's notice the word soul in the keyword concordance as well. Many of these definitions are invaluable here and are worthy of much thought. On page 279, soul. The sensation. Soul is the sensation resulting from the combination of an organic body with breath, or by implication or figuratively, spirit, by the imperceptible power which we are able to know something of when we liken it to a blast of air, when the Spirit of God comes into an organic body and it now lives. The sensation which results from having that organic body and then putting the breath or spirit of life into it, then you have a living soul, or you have a creature which has sensation in it. And the Authorized Version in Genesis 1, verse 21, renders the word for soul by creature, and they have kept back a very important thought here. For we see that soul is not a matter that just applies to human beings by any means. And creating is the Elohim great monsters, and every living, moving soul with which the water roams, for their from kind, and every winged flyer for its from kind, or that which it comes from. And seeing is the Elohim that it is good. The every living, moving soul with which the water roams, these creatures which roamed about the waters as originally created. Now let's notice further here in the keyword concordance that soul is connected with the blood. In Leviticus 17 verse 14, again, the authorized has obscured a matter that other versions have corrected. Leviticus 17 and verse 14. For as to the life of all flesh, I'm reading from the Revised now, the blood thereof is all one with the life thereof. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, you shall eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all flesh, it says here, is the blood thereof. No, it's the soul of all flesh is the blood thereof. There is the sensation of all flesh. It is that right there in the blood. One friend had considered the matter of being able to do dental work on a person who had all the blood removed from their gums, and if that wasn't there, they wouldn't have the sensation and wouldn't feel the pain. The sensation or the perception of experience comes in the presence of blood, and this is possessed by all living creatures that move. Note down Leviticus 11 verse 46 to substantiate that. And by metonymy, or near association, a human being may be considered from the standpoint of its sensations or experienced and called a soul, as in Revelation 6 verse 9, or that's used in Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 4 and verse 20 as well. The soul that sins, it shall die. Speaking of the man himself, but speaking of one aspect of the person, that the man has soul, or has a soul. He has a capacity to experience sensations. And this sensation or consciousness which he has, which is produced in him, is the result of the combination of the body, the organic living body that he has, with spirit. Now, we want to note and be very clear on this, that soul is a phenomena. It is not a substance. Soul is a phenomenon. It is not a substance. It's the consciousness or sensation which is produced and manifest and present when a living body has imperceptible power to produce action, life, and intelligence. Then what is experienced or sensed, what one is conscious of, that is what we must think of when we use the word soul, for that's what we're talking about. And it's not a substance or some kind of matter or anything that would have substance to it. It is merely an observable phenomena. And when we're speaking of phenomena, we're speaking of something that is an observable fact that can be scientifically described. And when we speak of something that is scientific, we mean scientific knowledge. We're speaking of systematized knowledge, which is derived from observation and study. And we can see and observe the matter of soul or sensation, but it is not a substance. It's merely that which is manifest when the power or the spirit is put into a living or an organic body. Now, Paul spoke of his dissolution in 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 and 7. It is not departure, as in the Authorized, but in English, a good equivalent of the Greek, is dissolution. Spoke of his dissolution being imminent. In light of this, I would like to share what I think is a very helpful illustration of the relationship between our bodies and our spirit and our soul. For I think we all know what we're speaking of when we speak of our bodies. And as you study and think about the things that I've just shared concerning soul and spirit, When I say, or when you think, or you say the word spirit, you'll think of the power of that which produces action, life, and intelligence. It is that which produces, or the power thereof. And when you think of soul, you'll think of the sensation or the observable consciousness and experienceable consciousness or sensation which is present in a living being which has blood. It would not be true of a plant, for instance, but it would be true that soul is present in even those creatures which roam the oceans, as well as in man and in what people generally call lower animals. Now, the illustration I would give of the relation between the body, soul, and spirit, and to consider the matter of the dissolution of death, would be to compare it, that is death, to the going out of an electric light when an electric light was turned off. Now, the power or electric current may be compared with the spirit. In my example, let's let the power or the electric current that runs through the wire and then comes into the bulb, let's have that electric current or electric power be likened to or compared with the spirit. And of course the spirit, as I have said many times now, this is the power of life, and this comes from God. Let's let the filament and the bulb represent the body, be likened to the body. And let us have the light which is produced in the bulb, let's let that be likened to the soul. Compare that to the soul, or the sensation, the phenomena, which is may be sensed and consciously aware of. And I think that's a very good illustration, and it's been very helpful to me. Now, in Psalm 104, verse 29, it speaks of the matter of death coming and of God withdrawing his spirit. Psalm 104:29. Thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, or their spirit. They die and return to their dust. Well, considering that, we might think of with the light bulb that when the current or power is cut off, as when God takes away his imperceptible power which produces our life and action and intelligence, that we die. Well, likewise, when the current or the power is cut off from the light bulb, the light, that is the observable phenomena of the light itself and the heat which was there with the light, in most lights anyhow, that phenomenon, that ceased to be. It became unseen. It returned to the unseen condition. It no longer, in this case, it would be certainly a condition. It was not in a existing form, but it was in a non-existing form. The light goes to the unseen, and the filament and the bulb remain. They would be like the body. And when the bulb is no longer of use, it will be ready to return to the soil where it came from. And the same is so with man. When the thread of life is broken, man vanishes from among the living. The spirit, which is the power of life, action, and intelligence. I hope I say it many times and you lay hold of it in one of them. This spirit returns to God who gave it. And the soul, consisting of the sensations of consciousness, returns to the unseen or imperceptible state of sheol or Hades. That it's unseen. And the body returns to the soil of the ground. Scripturally, all mankind, believer and unbeliever, undergo this dissolution and return in death, a state in which they remain until God, by his powerful operation through Christ, brings them forth in resurrection. Well, in our next study, I want to get specifically into what the Scriptures declare concerning the state of death, concerning those who are dead. We will also consider, God willing, some human testimonies of various people who claim to have been dead for a short time and to have experienced certain things, and we will compare these with what the Scriptures clearly declare in very positive passages for our faith. And we will also hopefully consider a few passages which are put up against other passages by some, and this cannot be, for the Scripture cannot be broken. What we want to do is we want to understand all these passages, and so we'll be considering more specifically the matter of death itself, and considering that in some depth in our next study. But I'm glad that in these two studies now that we've had, that we've been able to go through the matter of the English word hell and the Greek Hades and the Hebrew sheol, the Greek Gehenna and Tartarus, and paradisos or paradise, and here we've studied the soul and the spirit. And we also considered the lake of fire briefly in the former study as well. So these are many things to have gone through, and if you'll take good notes and go over these things much, you should be able to get a lot out of this study. I hope this will be a blessing to you, and also pray that God would use our next study in the matter of death itself, death and resurrection, to be a real blessing to you, to become settled and convicted in what God's Word declares on these things, and to not be unsettled or movable by human testimony, however much we might admire the people who say it. But we want to recognize that whatever is not of faith is sin, and to believe God alone, and let every man be a liar. So God's grace be with you all until we're able to study these matters further in the final discussions on these subjects in death and resurrection.